I bring before you yet another weekly WoW recap. As usual, we'll divide this into 3 parts, the first part being the tech talk. The first one is quite hard to pull off, but it happens in Neltharus. This one is to do with Forgemaster Gorek, one of the harder bosses in the dungeon. The healing output required from your healer is quite high, as the boss relentlessly does group-wide damage for the whole fight. One ability in particular does a lot of damage and can be avoided. It's called Blazing Aegis, and it's when he throws his shield at 3 players, bouncing consecutively from each player. Upon hitting these players, it would launch out swirlies in an X formation. I'm sure you know which one I'm talking about. A really cool trick here is that if you're the first player to be targeted by this shield toss, if you use a combat breaking ability such as Shadow Meld or Greater Invisibility, he will literally cancel his cast and not do it at all. That is a ridiculous amount of damage you're nullifying just like that. I would compare this to last season's Halls of Valor. If you can recall, Fenrir had a bleed that did an insane amount of damage, and groups with a composition that made it possible to dodge the bleed made the fight significantly easier. It is no different here. Thing is, I'm pretty sure the shield throws are random, in that you can't bait the shield to go to one person specifically first. So that makes dodging the shield toss here significantly harder than Fenrir. But if you do pull it off, you're going to feel amazing. The second tech talk this week is about Brackenhide Hollow. No surprise, it's once again about the first boss. That first boss is very problematic, dealing a lot of damage really quickly. And just like with the previous tech, you will need a combat dropping ability such as Invisibility, Shadow Meld, or Feign Death. There are 2 abilities in this fight that you can dodge with these techniques. The first is the Fixate. Normally, how the fight goes, Gashtooth will jump to everyone applying a bleed. Then immediately after, Gashtooth will fixate on one player and deal damage 8 times over 4 seconds. While you cannot dodge this bleed, you can dodge the Fixate. If you're fixated, simply use one of the aforementioned abilities and you're out of there. No damage taken. It's amazing. The second ability, that's not quite as dangerous that you can dodge, is Savage Charge from Hackclaw. Normally, Hackclaw takes about 8 seconds to channel this charge. And if the tank doesn't position themselves between the boss and you, Hackclaw will one-shot you. Or you could just nullify this damage entirely by using one of the aforementioned abilities. Pretty cool trick. Combat dropping abilities are very versatile and is one of the reasons why Night Elves are so powerful. Maybe only bested by Dwarves with their insane racial. And now we're up to the last tech talk of the week. This one is once again about Neltharus. As I mentioned last week, there was a change made to some of the environmental chains in the dungeon. Previously, you would pick up one of these chains and walk it through an enemy. Problem is, when you walk through the enemy, you also damage yourself in addition to damaging the enemies. And the amount of damage you do to yourself is ridiculous. I'm talking 500,000 damage. Not only to yourself, but also any other nearby players. The change made it so that the chains no longer ever damage players. This is massive. Each chain can be picked up an infinite number of times, limited only by the debuff duration on your character. So, given that your tank can survive a big pull, undoubtedly, the right play is to group up a whole bunch of these mobs, make sure they're all stacked up, have 2 or 3 players drag their chains and blow this pack up. These chains will one-shot the birds. These chains will 3-shot any hunters. Seriously, these chains are ridiculous. These chains can shorten the duration of pulls down to almost 30 seconds. You're giving up too much time in this dungeon if you don't use these chains. Learn the positions of these chains and use them in all your runs. You will never regret it. And that's it for the tech talk, and let's go into the updates for the week. Let's first talk about the hotfixes over the past week. There aren't very many, so I'll touch on all of them briefly. Twice over, they have made the difficulty of the raid Aberrus easier for smaller groups, all the way down to 10 players. These nerfs were applied to Echo of Neltharion, Vigilant Steward Zakarn, and Scale Commander Sarkareth. I know I normally cover M+ only, but there is really not much to talk about this week, so I might as well talk about the raid. Past that, the hotfixes this week don't cover much. There weren't any major changes to tuning for classes or for dungeons. This is probably the quietest week so far we've had in terms of dungeon tuning. Can't say I agree with that. I think some of the dungeons still have outliers. Particularly Norax's in Neltharian's Lair still poses a great difficulty, and the last boss in Vortex Pinnacle I think might need a few more nerfs. And with live game updates out of the way, let's talk about the PTR updates. I'm going to start with the biggest one, the new Mythic upgrade track. On the PTR server, Mythic raid items now have a new track. Most Mythic raid items start at 441 eye level. This makes them quite poor rewards, as why do Mythic when you can just do Heroic and level the item up to 441 with the hero track? This seems to address that, making Mythic raid items now scale all the way up to 447. There's no new currency, you will still use the Aspect Shadowflame's crest, and I'm going to assume that this will be applied retroactively, which would mean that you can level up your current Mythic raid items to 447 in the future. However, Mythic Plus players do not fear. This applies very slightly to you as well. Gear you get from the Great Vault that drops at 441 or 447 will now also be on this track. So while this change may not affect Mythic Plus players' end of dungeon loot, it will affect their end of week loot. This makes 16s and 18s significantly more enticing for Great Vault, as then you would be able to level up a 441 item all the way to 447. I think this is a great change to increase the quality of Mythic raid loot, especially the first few bosses. They didn't feel very rewarding. Past the new item upgrade track, this week's PTR patch notes don't detail very much, with more consistent changes to the same classes. This includes Feral Druid, Augmentation Evoker, Fire Mage, Frost Mage, and Holy Paladin. The changes here are quite minor, and there's a good chance any changes I describe here will go right over your heads, as these changes are iterations on a new system. Some abilities you might not be familiar with. Other changes, such as value changes, might be meaningless to you because you don't have the big picture. It's quite difficult to judge these changes in a vacuum, and quite frankly, not fair. I'll put a few of them up on screen in case you wish to read them, or if you'd prefer, I'll leave them in the description for you to read yourself. That is the end of the updates portion, and now we're at the part about my week in WoW. What happened this week? Well, this is the first week after we killed Sarkareth, and it has been quiet. Barely anyone on in what would normally be primetime gaming hours. When there would normally be 3 or 4 Mythic Plus groups running at the same time, there is only now ever one. My group. But speaking of my group, this past Thursday we did quite a few keys. And I'm pretty sure we've collected all of our dungeon portals for the season. I'm not sure how much longer we'll be consistently playing, because the only goal that is really within our reach is portals. The next goal after that would be top 0.1%, but there is a significantly low chance of that ever happening to us. So motivation might falter, but we will see over the coming weeks. These dungeons are becoming a lot easier. You can chalk it up to a few things. More familiarity with dungeon mechanics, better gear, or maybe better cohesion between the group. All are very valid points. I think gearing might have been slightly too quick this season. It feels weird to be almost kitted out on the 6th week of the season. I'm sure not a lot of people are complaining. They can enjoy their time elsewhere in Diablo 4 or other games. Nothing wrong with that. But some players might enjoy the thrill of gear hunting. And with that out of the way so early, people might lose motivation to play. It's always important to take into account other people's perspectives when forming an opinion. And giving this some thought, personally, I think gearing was too fast. I think Blizzard should nerf it slightly next season. It is still yet to be seen if we will enter Mythic Raid. I am fairly certain that we do not have the numbers to sustain it, but we will see this coming Monday. That pretty much covers my week in WoW. Not too much happening. I will say, however, that finding 3 techs for every week is surprisingly difficult. It's difficult to differentiate what is common knowledge in the community and what is actually useful new information. But I always try my best. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like or subscribe, and I'll see you in my next weekly WoW recap.